have enough time to have the conversation and some questions and answers. So I saw that test started recording. So did you guys talk about that, about the recording, that it's okay?
Yeah,
all right, and so fantastic, thank you. Right, and so for everybody else, we are recording these. Great, so I can introduce you. So everyone, I'm happy to introduce Emla Fitzsimons, who is a professor of economics at the University College London and affiliated with the Institute of Education and Center for Longitudinal Studies. And Professor Fitzsimons' research focuses a lot on understanding how early experiences, parental investments, and various policies affect longer-term outcomes, both looking at mental health and psychosocial as well as cognitive. And her work has, she's done work in many countries, but today we'll hear mostly about work in the UK from the Millennium Cohort study, which she is the director of. So without further ado, thank you, Emla, and over to you. And what I'll do, so I wanted to ask you how you wanted to handle questions or comments, whether sort of, whether you have natural pauses in the presentation or wait till the end. Do you have any preferences?
Yeah, I don't mind. I'm happy to be, interrupted as we go along. I'm used to that. And yeah, right. Whatever suits. If people want to jump in, please do. That's right. Totally fine.
Okay, so fantastic. So yeah, if you all want to jump in or type in the chat, and I can jump in and ask whatever people are most comfortable with.
Okay, brilliant.
Awesome.
Great.
Right,
okay. Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much for inviting me to give this talk. It's great to be here virtually, and thanks a lot for joining. So yeah, this is a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, I guess, of a body of research that I've been working on with colleagues over the past few years, looking at mental health among young people using the Millennium Cohort study data, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a while. So what I wanted to focus on was just some of the high-level findings, and also at various points I'll highlight where some of these findings have had quite important impact in terms of public debate and the policy sort of discourse over in the UK. And I think certainly here we're increasingly being encouraged and pushed to increase our impact and maximize the visibility of our research and so on. So I thought it would just be nice to sort of showcase some of those examples with some, fairly high level descriptive statistics that we've produced from the study, but really, really important ones. Oops, oh, hang on, there we go. Okay, so just briefly, I'm aware that I've got about an hour, so I'll aim to speak for 40 to 45 minutes, depending on interruptions. We can see how it goes. But just by way of background, we know that around half of all mental ill health disorders start before the age of 14. And, there are major impacts, as we all know, of mental illness on people's lives and on society as a whole. So provision for early support and intervention is really, really important. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. And despite recent targeted increases over in the UK, child and adolescent mental health accounts for less than 10% of the overall mental health budget. And that represents just under 1% of the overall budget of the UK National Health Service. So a very, very small proportion of the health budget is dedicated to child and adolescent mental health. So what that means is that there are very significant levels of unmet need in children and young people's mental health care. And I've given some examples of this, that some other studies have found. So for instance, specialist services are turning away around 1 in 4 of children referred to their GPs or teachers for treatment. We know that over 300,000 children were referred to the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service in 2017. And less than a third received treatment within a year. So there are very big delays in services. And we also know that around 3/4 of young people experiencing a mental health problem are forced to wait so long that their condition either gets worse or they're unable to access any treatment. So it's a really, major issue. in the UK and elsewhere. Alongside that, I think we're all aware there are very widespread concerns about the impact of COVID-19 in general, but in particular with the associated periods of lockdown and isolation and uncertainty about future prospects for children and young people's mental health. So that's something I'll come back to as well a little bit later. So I've said already, there's a lot of evidence that the majority of adult mental health problems are rooted in childhood. And we also know that a long shadow is cast by childhood mental health problems on adult life and on a variety of different domains. So for instance, education, economic outcomes such as employment and earnings, physical health, relationships, and so on. And just one example of some research some colleagues of mine did some years ago, looking at the impacts of childhood psychological problems on family income. And they found that people who experienced childhood psychological problems had lower family income, reaching a peak at around age 50 of around 28% lower compared to those who didn't experience such problems. And a number of contributing factors are listed on the slide. And they found that the experience of adult psychological problems was a major pathway through which later effects occurred. So really, really important long-term effects, and they're echoed in a variety of studies. So we know that the origins and the consequences of mental ill health are complex and multifaceted. So I think that really highlights the importance of taking a multidisciplinary approach to this. So I'm an economist and I work a lot with psychologists and sociologists and epidemiologists. And I think it's increasingly important to do that and to bring different sort of types of knowledge and methods to the topic. And understanding the scale of the problem and how it changes over time is really, really important. And having rich data on several aspects of life and following people over time is absolutely key to understanding the origins of developmental difficulties and how they feed through to lasting inequalities. So in this sense, I would say that large-scale birth cohort studies are really unique sources of data for answering a lot of different questions in this area. So that brings me to what I do and where I'm based. So I'm based at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, which is at UCL in London. And we run 4 major national longitudinal studies, which follow people throughout life. And we lead the scientific development and the design of the studies. And we're funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council as a resource centre. And our remit is to collect the data and to provide it to the wider scientific and policy community. So we collect data and then we put it in a data repository and people can freely access that data after each sweep. And we're also funded as a research group. And as I mentioned already, we're a very strong multidisciplinary team covering different disciplines. And in terms of the 4 studies we run, they're listed here on this chart. So our oldest is the National Child Development Study, which follows a cohort of babies born in a particular week in 1958. That's followed 12 years later by the 1970 British Cohort Study, following a cohort born in a particular week in April of 1970. We also run a study called Next Steps, which follows a cohort of individuals born in the early 90s. And that is not a birth cohort. That started when they just started secondary school. So they were around 12, 13. And then the study that I'm the principal investigator of is the last one here, the Millennium Cohort Study. So that's a cohort of around 20,000, just under 20,000 people born across the UK in 2000 to 2001. And unlike the other 3, it covers all 4 countries of the UK. So it also includes Northern Ireland. And it's a nationally representative sample of 20,000 people born at the turn of the century. So most of what I'll present today is based on the Millennium Cohort Study data. This is the MCS study, literally at a glance, and I don't expect you to absorb this, but just to show you really the types of data we collect and the ages at which we've collected it. So we've had 7 major sweeps of the study so far, and these are major in the sense that they're home visits. We collect data via face-to-face home visits, and they're kind of long 2 to 3 hour interviews by trained interviewers that we use via fieldwork agency. So we've got lots of data from parents, which are represented by the blue bar here, right throughout the study. And then from cohort members, which are shown on the red bars, we have questionnaire self-completion from age 7 onwards, lots of physical measurements, cognitive assessments. We've got activity monitor data at certain sweeps and time use records. And very excitingly, we also have genetic data since age 14. And that's from cohort members and also their resident biological parents. So we've around, 25,000 saliva samples that have been genotyped. And again, that data are available upon request to be used. So that's kind of a snapshot of the data and when we have collected different pieces of information. And as mentioned already, our next survey is planned for age 22. We're just developing that now. Okay, so in terms of the evidence and what has kind of emerged from the data so far, like I said, I'll sort of give a whistle-stop tour and present different bits that we've looked at through different papers. So the first piece of evidence I wanted to show is the prevalence of mental health problems across childhood. So these are based on parent report measures. And these are based on the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which measure children's difficulties in 4 areas: emotional, conduct, hyperactivity, and peer relationships. And scores above a particular threshold are indicative of high levels of difficulty in that area. So in terms of what we found in the study throughout childhood, here's a picture which shows behavior problems from ages 3 through 14 for males and females. Males are the red and females are blue. So what we see is that at age 3, behavior problems are quite high, so reaching around 1 in 5 males and slightly fewer females. And then they drop quite significantly at age 5, where we've got about 1 in 10 males experiencing behavior problems as reported by parent, which is usually maternal reported. And then they sort of stay fairly stable and start to increase again from age 11 and through age 14, where about 15% of males and just over 10% of females are reported to have behavior problems, conduct problems. And this pattern, I think, is fairly well mirrored in other studies as well, this kind of high initial levels that sort of drop and then rise again in late childhood and early adolescence. So that's behavior problems. So looking at emotional problems, again, red are male and blue are females. So here we see that actually there's not such a sex difference in the early years from ages 3 through 11. They're fairly similar. There's quite a steep rise between age 7 and 11, both for boys and girls, from below 10% quite to about 12 to 13%. And then between 11 and 14, we observe quite an interesting difference to emerge between sexes. So we see males stay fairly stable and females rise quite significantly in terms of emotional problems between 11 and 14, from about 12 or 12.5% to 18% by age 14. So that's really the first time that we see that sex difference emerging in adolescence. Right, so they were maternal report measures. So at age 14 in the study, we obtained self-report measures of mental health difficulties for the first time. So cohort members answered questions via self-completion. And the instrument we administered was the Short Moods and Feelings questionnaire, which assesses symptoms of depression. And again, as I'm sure you're aware, it assesses feelings or behaviors in the previous fortnight, such as I felt miserable or unhappy. And again, a score above a particular threshold is indicative of suffering from depression. So this was a really big, I would say, significant finding at age 14. So when we measured this, we found that about 24% of girls at age 14 report high levels of depressive symptoms, compared with about 10% of boys, as shown in that simple infographic in front of you. Because this is a nationally representative study, we can scale that up and try to understand roughly how many young people across the UK that equates to. So that's around 67,000 boys amongst boys born in 2000, 2001, and about 166,000 girls nationally of the total populations of 730,000 boys and 696,000 girls. So that was a really stark finding. I think it was the first time in a long time that this had been looked at, and the first time certainly that this was looked at for this particular generation. So we released a briefing paper. We wrote an academic paper on this, but we first released a briefing paper, a 4-page briefing paper, just describing the findings and showing some infographics along with it. And there was a lot of media interest in the findings. As you can see here, I've just put some of the headlines. And I think that, I suppose we ourselves were quite taken aback by the extent of interest in the finding. It was a fairly, high-level descriptive statistic from the study, but when we reflected on it, the reality was there was no other national data source at that time that could provide nationally representative prevalence figures. So it was a really important figure to release. It was also the first evidence to emerge in the UK in over a decade for looking at mental health problems amongst teenagers, and it showed a dramatic increase compared to previous findings from 10 years previously. The fact that this data was embedded within a longitudinal study makes it very powerful for understanding drivers of mental health, including from very early in life. So I think that was another important feature that was important in terms of the impact of the finding. And so there was lots of interest then in understanding the drivers and so on of such high levels of mental ill health. Another important feature, I suppose, which was important in terms of impact, was it was timed for release just ahead of the government green paper on children and young people's mental health provision. And that was really important. So we didn't wait for the academic paper to come out, but we sort of expedited a press release and a briefing paper and got it published so that it would come out just ahead of the consultation paper on children and young people's mental health. So I think all of these features were important in terms of, reaching public discourse and reaching policymakers. And so there's quite a nice quote there from the NHS National Mental Health Director, who said, in response to the findings, after decades in the shadows, children's mental health is finally in the spotlight. And that's certainly how it felt at the time, with a lot of interest in that particular finding. We also looked at well-being, or sort of life satisfaction and happiness as well. And I suppose our research drew attention to an important yet often overlooked distinction between mental ill health and mental well-being in young people. So there is debate around whether the two constructs represent sort of two ends of the same spectrum of mental health or two distinct domains that have some overlap. And what we found from the child report measures is that the absence of mental health difficulties doesn't necessarily equate to positive well-being. And so it's important to measure both to get a full picture and to best support young people. And we also found that parent and child reports of emotional or depressive symptoms have a very weak correlation. And again, the main message to come from that was the fact that child reports are very, very important to collect as well, alongside parent reports. And this was important because it informed a review which was being carried out by Public Health England, which was the main body at the time responsible for children and young people's mental health, of the existing metrics within its profile to use. And it's incorporated, I suppose, the positive aspects of well-being as well as mental illness into those metrics. Oops. We compared a wide range of predictors of children's mental ill health and subjective well-being, and we were able to do this for the exact same sample using the exact same predictors, which was again a nice feature of the study. And we could look at factors from earlier on in childhood and earlier on in their lives. And this highlighted that the risk and protective factors can differ, and it set out particular concrete areas for policy action. And that was picked up quite a lot by policymakers. In terms of areas that they could focus on. So this was well, I would call it quite a busy infographic we produced. I remember at the time thinking it was very busy. It's showing factors associated with mental illness and with well-being and the overlap between them in the middle part. But it got a lot of traction from policy makers. And I think partly they quite liked how we, separated into 4 different colors representing 4 different domains of children and young people's lives. So the blue being their individual characteristics, red being family and relationships, etc. But it also highlighted very clearly how the risk and protective factors do have quite distinct components as well as some overlap. And that was quite an important finding for them and was used quite a lot in policy circles. So I think it shows the sort of power of a visual or infographic to kind of bring findings to policymakers as well. Public Health England director at the time said the findings helped to clearly communicate the case for a whole system response to children and young people's mental health. So we were pleased with that. So there's some findings showing, I suppose, the prevalence of different facets of mental illness in childhood and early adolescence. So maybe I'll pause right now in case anyone would like to ask a question or clarification at this point. Let me check the time. Okay.
Well, I have a question. I was really interested by at which point you started asking children themselves factors. So I know you mentioned, I think on the initial slide, it referenced age 7, but then the mental health at age 14. And then you mentioned that, the parental and child is very weakly correlated. Yeah. So I wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit more about that, about parent report versus child, and how you navigate that transition and how it changed, some of these questions and findings.
Yeah. So we started administering a questionnaire to the cohort members themselves, to the children at age 7, but quite a broad questionnaire about, their school lives and hobbies and things like that, various aspects of their lives. So at age 11, we also included measures of well-being, so happiness with their friends and their appearance, and we measured well-being, but we didn't ask anything specifically around mental health. By age 14, that was the first time we included the short moods and feelings questionnaire. So that was the first time we felt it was, I suppose, appropriate at that point to include that. I think age 11 would have been a little bit too soon. And normally I remember we did some cognitive testing and focus groups around certain questions, and that was one that was included at age 14 in terms of its acceptability, both to the young people themselves and also their parents. And so at that point, we decided that, it was appropriate to include it at that point. In terms of parents, so the correlation I was referring to was between the short moods and feelings questionnaire at age 14 as reported by the child and the SDQ as reported by the parent. So from parents, since age 3, we've been collecting the SDQ, and we've got that through to 17. And at 17, we also have the young person report of the SDQ. So yeah, that was a little bit of a convoluted answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's perfect.
So in the next part, I'll briefly talk about some research we've been doing, which is delving a little bit more into the factors affecting mental ill health in childhood and adolescence.
Can I ask one question before you go on? Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
So I was interested in those patterns that you were showing, looking at the behavioral and emotional problems over the different ages. So what is that an index, and like what are are there certain factors that are driving that over time, and is it changing as the kids age? So for example, that pattern you saw in the behavioral problems where it kind of dips and comes back up.
Yeah.
Things or?
So yeah, I think it's fairly well established anyway. So in early, like around the age of 3, it kind of refers to conduct problems and hyperactivity, which tend to be quite high in sort of toddlerhood and early childhood. And then they sort of improve slightly in childhood and once children start to enter school. And then in early adolescence, they tend to again rise a little bit, these kind of externalizing type of problems.
Different types.
And then the emotional symptoms show more of a sort of quite low through early childhood and later childhood and then start to rise in early adolescence, particularly for girls. And I think, again, that's a fairly well-established pattern where the kind of internalizing or emotional symptoms tend to show quite an increase in girls in the early adolescent period. Yeah.
So they're kind of different underlying items that are driving those over time. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a scale that has, so there are 4 subscales. Each of the 4 subscales has 5 items within it. And so each of those was 10 items. Each of those 2 graphs was 10 of those. Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's nice to kind of see my future with my kids being.
Yeah, that's exactly what it'll. Okay. Right.
Sorry, I have one quick question as well.
Yeah.
On the infographic you just showed a couple of slides ago, were those the measures of emotional well-being on the right? Like, did you consider things like self-esteem and resilience? Or was it just those factors that were included in your infographic?
So it was mainly the factors in the infographic. Some of them we may not have shown if they weren't statistically significant, or they may just be really, really small, so we didn't put them in there. But yeah, it was mainly what was in the infographic. We didn't have measures of resilience or self-esteem. Self-esteem we do have, but not possibly measured at the same time as the outcome variables. So we didn't particularly want to include that as a control, as a regressor. But yeah, I agree. They're also important in terms of, how they relate to the outcomes. Yeah.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, of course.
Did you ask both the fathers and the mothers about the same questions, or how did you?
Yeah, there's usually one of the parents acts as the main respondent to the survey, and that's usually the mother.
Okay.
So for the SDQ, I think it's like over 90%, even 95% of the time, it's the mother who responds.
I was wondering if they were responding.
Yeah, it's interesting, but we don't have, it would be nice to compare, but we don't have enough fathers who answer it. Yeah. Okay. So just briefly, we've done a few papers looking at some factors affecting mental ill health in childhood. So risk factors for mental health problems, as we know, include common occurrences in young people's lives, such as poverty, long-term physical illness, bereavement, family breakdown, etc. And of course, it's essential to understand potential triggers and risk factors to help shape policy and prevent longer-term mental health issues from developing. So we have a few papers that look at instability in childhood in 3 particular areas as listed here. So the first is poverty, where we look at transitions in poverty. So entering poverty, exiting poverty, and persistent poverty. The second aspect we looked at is parental mental health, and transitions in it. So improving, deteriorating, or staying the same, whether that's persistently good or persistently bad. And family structure in terms of parental separation or divorce. So we have 2 papers covering these 3 topics. So the first is looking at poverty dynamics and parental mental health. And I think we know from lots and lots of research that poverty is correlated with mental ill health. And this is just showing income quintiles at age 11, and how emotional, peer, conduct, and hyperactivity, so they're the different subscales of the SDQ, how they correlate with income at age 11. So what you'll see is a pattern whereby generally emotional problems, for instance, tend to be higher amongst those in the lowest income quintile, and then they gradually decline as you move to the highest income quintile. And that's a pattern that's observed across all of these particular domains of the SDQ. So that's fairly well known, I would say, but there's far less known about fluctuations in poverty and the extent to which they may influence children's mental health, or the extent to which they matter. So we know that average income matters, but what about the variance in income? It was really the question we were looking at here. And in brief, what we found, again, I think it's just a nice feature of the longitudinal design that we can do this, because we've observed income at 5 different stages in childhood. So when we look at this, we find that persistent poverty tends to be more detrimental at early ages, and fluctuations in poverty or adverse income shocks tend to have more of an adverse impact later on in childhood. So these are the two main findings. So living in persistent poverty throughout early childhood is strongly predictive of poor mental health by age 5. And poverty transitions during our early childhood are not predictive of poor mental health by age 5. So if it's just, say, one adverse income shock, but a higher average income, then we don't find that it's predictive of poor mental health. What we do find is that poverty transitions, and specifically adverse income shocks or moving into poverty, are much more strongly predictive of poor mental health by age 11 than living in persistent poverty throughout childhood. So adverse income shocks seem to have a very negative impact on children's mental health in late childhood rather. In terms of why this might be, we have some hypotheses. So one might be that by age 11, children may be more aware of economic transitions that are taking place around them, and they're less aware of those obviously earlier on in their lives. But I think the bottom line of this research is that only looking at current poverty, as the vast majority of research does, misses an important dimension of economic circumstances, and actually looking at income shocks is also very, very important. We also look at, within the same paper, parental mental health fluctuations. So again, we know that parental mental health is an important correlate of childhood mental health. And we take that one step further and we look at how changes in parental mental ill health during childhood affect their children's mental health. And so we consider movements from good to poor mental health and vice versa, as well as persistent mental ill health amongst parents. So here we can look separately at mums and dads. And what we find is that persistent maternal mental ill health in childhood is most detrimental to children at both ages 5 and 11, which are the two ages we're able to look at. We also find that the association between parental mental health and children's mental health is typically larger for mums than for dads, but with the caveat that I mentioned already, that the children's mental health measures are largely maternal reported. But I think the main sort of key policy message from this paper is that it's important to support parents experiencing difficulties to maintain positive relationships as well with their children. And yeah, sorry.
There's a question in the chat related to this, if I can, which is, are you able to distinguish reverse causation? That is, could the onset of children's mental health conditions cause an increase in caregiving needs, and thus one parent reduces labor market participation? So I guess it's for the previous outcome.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a good question. So so these are based on individual fixed effects models, which obviously doesn't reduce reverse causation, but it reduces unobserved time invariant confounding. But we always lag the regressors, the X variables. So we have our outcome at a particular age as a function of prior breakdown, which kind of mitigates reverse causality concerns, but of course it's not foolproof in terms of eliminating them, but that's how we deal with that. So in terms of income fluctuations, it's looking at kind of past income shocks and how that affects current mental health. So yeah.
Thank you. And there's one more question. It would be good to hear more about assessment of poverty. What were the measures used and approach used to measuring income shocks? Also poverty and paternal mental health well-being and its association with kids' mental health would be good to know too, right? So this is just maternal. So kind of two questions about how were the income shocks measured and poverty, and then, yeah.
Yeah, so the income, so we have very, very detailed measures of income in the study at all sweeps. It's probably the longest part of the module for parents that we measure different sources of income, so earnings and also benefits and so on. And the measure of income we use here is equivalized family income. So it does take account of sort of the household family size. So that's how, and then we basically measure deviations from the average in terms of the income shock over time. And the question around the paternal, yeah. So to look at, what was the question exactly? To look at the relationship between the father's mental health and poverty. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yep, paternal. So I guess, yeah.
Yeah, we haven't done that in terms of seeing how, yeah, that's interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, or indeed we haven't done it. Yeah, we've just done it in terms of the child as the outcome variable. Yeah. That's
And then
nice.
I have one more question about the income shocks and how it differs for kids of older ages. So, I mean, would this taken to an extreme situation, would this suggest that if you have two kids, one who, you know, sort of parents were always poor from the time they were born to the time they were 11, and then you had parents who, you know, were poor early, and then there was, you know, a policy put in place to help lift them out of poverty, but it only managed to lift them out of poverty temporarily, and then they kind of back in, that this 11-year-old's mental health would be worse after having that temporary non-poverty period back in, or I'm just trying to, you know what I'm.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, because I guess what we're looking at is it's persistently good, and then they have the negative. We don't really, yeah, look at whether it's persistently low and then they have a positive and then it goes back down, because that we don't observe that very much in the data. So I think it's more we can observe the adverse shocks, not the positive. So I don't know that we'd be able to make that conclusion that it's a symmetric sort of yeah, it's an interesting one, and I certainly wouldn't like to say that that would be an adverse policy.
Right. And I guess, and so I think, Sean, your question is related to this, which is for effects of income shocks, any indication if the mental health impacts have to do with relative or absolute income?
So I was basically asking a similar thing to Asha. So, you know, kind of one is their changes over time, but then also, you know, you can think of comparison to peers, you know, kind of a comparative poverty type.
Yeah. That's interesting. And there are questions in the study looking at how they see themselves in terms of their family wealth relative to peers. And I think people have looked at that. And if they perceive themselves to be worse off than their peers, how that is correlated with mental health. There's definitely some work around that. I think quite interesting findings in the certainly in the direction you might expect in adolescence, showing that those who perceive themselves to be a lot worse off tend to have lower levels of mental health. But yeah, the extent to which it's causal is not clear, but there's certainly associations there. There's some nice papers on that. Okay. Yeah, so the other, just keep an eye on the time. The other component we've looked at is father's departure in children's mental health, and in particular how or whether timing matters. So in the study, around 1/5 of families experience parental separation or divorce by the time the child is age 14. So that's amongst those who were from two-parent households at baseline. And we look at how this affects children's emotional and peer problems and hyperactivity and conduct problems. And we account for lots and lots of other background factors, and we also use individual fixed effects models in this analysis as well. And we find that family breakdown has a detrimental effect on children's mental health, and the timing of the breakdown and child gender matter and seem to interact with each other. So in terms of our main findings, we see that a breakdown in early childhood, so before age 5, doesn't appear to have any short or medium-term effects on boys, but has an adverse effect on girls, which persist right throughout childhood and early adolescence. So the main effects of the early childhood breakdown are observed for girls. And in terms of breakdown later on in mid to late childhood, so between ages 7 and 11, the main effects are observed here for boys. So we observe increases in boys internalizing and externalizing problems. And we observe some increase in girls internalizing problems, but they're much lower than what we observe for boys. Yeah, I think I will move on just in the interest of time. I have two more kind of areas to cover, so I might just move along, and then we can do some questions at the end. So I also wanted to present some work we've been working on most recently, which is looking at the age 17 data that we collected a few years ago and was recently deposited at the repository. And we look here at psychological distress, self-harm and attempted suicide amongst 17-year-olds in the UK. And we look at the prevalence and socio-demographic inequalities. And we look at inequalities in particular by sex, family income, ethnicity, and sexuality. So I just wanted to show you some of the findings from this research, which are quite stark. In terms of our sample by age 17, so we've around 10,000 individuals in the survey at age 17, around 50-50 female, around 81% are white and 19% ethnic minority, and around 1/4 of the sample is living in poverty, so below the poverty line. In terms of our measure of psychological distress at age 17, so this is measured from the young person themselves. So it's the Kessler 6-item measures, which asks respondents about feelings in the last 30 days in terms of the items listed here, as I'm sure you're familiar with. And total scores range from 0 to 24, and a score above 12, above 13 is indicative of serious levels of psychological distress. So when we measure that amongst the sample, we find that 16% have scores greater than or equal to 13, so indicative of high psychological distress. We also measure self-harm using the question shown here on the screen, and it's the 12-month prevalence of self-harming, so in the last year. And then we also measure self-harm with suicidal intent, and that's lifetime prevalence. So that's a yes/no question that we ask. And this is all asked in the self-completion module of the questionnaire. So in terms of self-harm, we find the prevalence is 24% overall, and suicide, self-harm with suicide intent is 7% overall. So we were very, very taken aback by these figures. There is no other data set in the UK that measures self-harm with suicidal intent and that can separate it out. So there's really kind of nothing else to compare it to at the moment. But 7% struck us as extremely high at age 17. We look at sex differences in both of those, and here it's an even starker picture. So high psychological distress, the graph on the left shows you the distribution of this, but what it basically shows is that it's higher, I suppose, as we would have expected, given the findings at age 14, it's higher amongst females than amongst males. So around 22% in females versus around 10% in males. Self-harm is much higher as well amongst females than males. So it's just under 30% in females and around 20% in males. And suicide attempt, again, is higher amongst females. So it's 11% amongst females versus 4% amongst males. We had also measured self-harm at age 14. So that enabled us to look at how the picture had changed since age 14, separately for males and females. And what we found is if you just look at the age 17 part, the gaps in self-harm behavior by sex were considerably narrower at age 17 compared to if you look at the equivalent difference at age 14. And what this really reflects is a steeper increase in self-harm rates amongst males than females between 14 and 17. So I think that was an important finding. Even though females are higher by 17, it's definitely a higher rise amongst males than females. So for these three outcomes, we look at inequalities by various dimensions, as I mentioned already. So one of those is income, and here we look at income quintile. And what you can see here is there is an income gradient for psychological distress and for attempted suicide, as shown in the right-hand panel. With those from richer backgrounds less likely to attempt suicide or to have more likely to have lower levels of psychological distress. But we don't observe any particular pattern by income for self-harm. And again, I think that's a finding that's also mirrored in some other papers. age 17 was the first time we asked quite a detailed question about sexuality and sexual identity. So we also look at the 3 outcomes I mentioned by whether or not the respondent identifies as heterosexual or sexual minority, so LGB+. And again, a very, very stark picture emerges when we do that. So sexual minority respondents are much more likely to report high psychological distress. So around 40% of that sample reports high psychological distress compared to just under 15% of the heterosexual sample. Self-harm significantly higher among sexual minority at just over 55% compared to around 20% for heterosexual. And suicide attempt, again, much, much higher among sexual minority, around 22% compared to around 6% amongst heterosexual. In terms of the size of the group that identifies sexual minority, it's around just over 10% of the sample at age 17. So it's just over 1,000 respondents. So it's a fairly big and robust sample that we can look at. So yeah, I think we were very taken aback by these findings, and yeah, very stark findings and very sad and shocking findings. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say for now on the age 17 results. I'll maybe very quickly just show you some other research we've been doing looking at some findings during the COVID pandemic. So as part of our kind of response to the COVID pandemic in terms of collecting data, we collected some data via online web surveys. So we did 3 web surveys, one last May, one in September, and one in January, just gone. And we have looked, they're quite short 20-minute online surveys, so we haven't been able to collect very detailed information on, or collect very detailed measures, but we have included some measures around mental health, using a set of common measures across the 4 cohorts that I mentioned earlier on in the talk. So the measures we use are listed here for mental ill health, for loneliness, and for well-being. So the very, very short versions of different scales, basically, that we use. And here I just want to show you quite a nice figure showing how the prevalence of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and low life satisfaction vary across the 4 cohorts that we host at CLS. And it's looking by males and females. And what you tend to see is that mental ill health symptoms tend to be much higher amongst the younger generations compared to the older generations. So these are the exact same measures collected at the exact same time using the exact same mode of data collection. So for instance, you can see for depression amongst males, much higher amongst the dark pink, which are the Millennium Cohort study at age 19, a bit lower amongst next steps, which are age 30, age 50, a bit lower, but not significantly so, and 62-year-olds quite a bit lower. And that pattern is mirrored across all the different outcomes we look at. So depression, anxiety, loneliness, and low life satisfaction. So really painting quite a stark picture here for the younger generations in terms of symptoms of depression and anxiety and loneliness. So that was in the first lockdown. We also looked at psychological distress. We had measures for the different cohorts before lockdown as well. In some cases, it was quite a few years before lockdown, but we looked at how the picture had changed in terms of the measures before and during COVID. And what you see here is for the older cohorts, males and females, you don't tend to see much difference in the pre versus during pictures. For age 30, that's less true. Certainly for females, you tend to see during COVID, the levels of psychological distress are significantly higher compared to the levels they reported before COVID, and that was a few years before. So of course, it's not a causal relationship, but it does indicate that COVID may be playing a role in these higher levels of distress for the younger generations. And when we look at the Millennium Cohort study, so comparing the age 17 and age 19 data, which is pretty close together, we see for males, we don't observe much difference in the before-during measures, whereas for females, we do observe during the pandemic, they tend to be reporting higher levels of psychological distress compared to beforehand. So again, this is not conclusive in terms of looking at the causal impact of COVID, but it certainly chimes with other research that has been looking at this using other sources of data, which tends to find that it's younger females who are tending to suffer most in terms of mental health during the pandemic compared to before. So I shall stop there and thank you all for your attention, and thanks to our funders and our host institution, and of course our cohort members and their families. And thank you all for listening. And yeah, I'd like to open it up to you guys, and please do ask questions or share ideas or whatever at this point. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. This is fantastic. I'll read a question from the chat. Would be good to hear if there were any public health or social sector programs that were going on. For example, any poverty alleviation programs or social support, cash transfers, etc., or times NHS mental health services sought or not. If there were such programs, interventions ongoing, were they accounted for? Or I guess, right, could be an interesting natural experiment.
Yes, in terms of yeah, it could be, that would be a nice natural experiment. None, I mean, there are, you know, kind of national programs like benefit programs and so on, and nothing in particular that I can think of that would differentially affect some cohort members in some areas, but not others. So I can think of kind of national means tested programs that, yeah, are targeted at the low income, but nothing more than that, I think, in terms of sort of income support. This is presumably, this is like not sort of COVID support. This is sort of pre-COVID we're thinking of, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so the idea is to use that as a natural experiment to see how that would, yeah. Maybe one could think of doing, yeah, it's interesting, yeah. I think so I'm aware there are national programs that provide income support, so maybe one could think of doing some regression discontinuity where people who just kind of missed the cutoff versus those, you know, above and below the threshold for the means testing are eligible. It's something to explore. Yeah, it's not something that I've looked at, or I'm not aware of any papers that have looked at that, particularly for mental health. So that's a nice idea, nice suggestion. Thank you. Yeah.
Sean.
So are you, so I assume you're like familiar with Lord Laird's stuff on happiness. So can you, so I know a little bit about it just because, you know, kind of through the, but, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong. So like one finding it seems that they have, right, is that, you know, kind of like, you know, mental health is a major driver of well-being, and they somehow are saying that it's more important than like income shocks, right? But those things are all related. So what I was trying to think about, you know, kind of how your research kind of ties into what that group is trying to do, and do you have kind of thoughts on kind of what the intersection is?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah. I know that doesn't, Lord Laird would say that, yeah, it's not about measuring national GDP, but it's more about measuring the well-being of the nation as a measure of, as a target for what we should be trying to achieve, right? Yeah, that's a very big question, Sean.
I know, but no, but I was thinking more about the kind of the mental health angle, and like kind of the connection between mental health and, you know, the well-being construct, right, which you talked about, and then the relationship between those two and income.
Yeah, right? I mean, yeah, and I guess we know that it's such an important facet of productivity, mental health, right? I mean, we know a lot about physical health, and we know a lot about, yeah, how that impacts on earnings and employment and so on, but we know far less about actually what is the link between mental health and earnings trajectories or productivity. And I suppose that's what Lord Laird would it's that link that I suppose their group is trying to kind of unpick.
Yeah.
And exactly, yeah. And so going to the root of it, it's really all about mental health and well-being is what we need to measure in order to then try to improve productivity. And if we can solve that, then GDP will naturally sort of, it will all be fine, but the target should be mental health and well-being, I think is a pretty strong message from their group, I think. Yeah, it's interesting, but yeah.
Yeah, because we're kind of like talking about, you know, on one hand, there's, you know, these kind of income-based policies, right, or policies that are to address poverty and, you know, address the income side, and then there's, you know, another set of policies where you're providing, you know, kind of in-kind mental health support, right? And so thinking about
I know, I mean,
look at this.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think increasingly employers are adopting more policies that are around supporting mental health, right? I think it is becoming something that's increasingly being recognized in workplaces, at least from what I see, it's certainly the case. And certainly the pandemic has, I think, brought that more to the fore. So I think it's around, yeah, a more holistic approach I think it's being recognized that it is important, and it's not just about transferring income or whatever, but it's also about thinking of other facets of people's working lives. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, but I think it's become much more acute due to the pandemic, certainly, from what I can see. You know, the need for policies around mental health and well-being. Yeah.
But the income gradients that you showed earlier on kind of suggest that, you know, those poverty alleviation programs, you know, for, you know, these households where children could have, you know, large impacts, right, on mental health subsequently, right? And so
yeah,
I wonder how that.
I know yeah. The structural economist in me would want to say, yeah, income transfers maybe would ultimately be the way to resolve it rather than trying to intervene within the household or try to. It's interesting. I think that's where the cross-disciplinary ideas and taking that more holistic approach to it is really, really important. It's not just about, yeah, income transfer kind of policies, but yeah, it's interesting.
Can I just ask one real quick question about, as you're moving forward for the next wave, when these people are now 22, is there a specific, like, does this wave have a specific focus, or kind of, is there anything, you know, kind of really new and different and exciting, or is there a different direction, or kind of what's the future of the next wave?
It's yeah, interesting. So I suppose one of the main objectives of the next wave is to keep the response rate high. So it's a kind of a critical risk point for the survey because it's a highly kind of mobile and dynamic phase of life, of course. So it's really, and it's the first time that the cohort members themselves will be engaging and not being kind of, you know, egged on by their parents a little bit or encouraged to take part. So one of the really key objectives, and is to maintain response rates. So in that sense, so the scientific content, we're not planning anything really, really exciting or innovative in terms of, I would say the age 14 sweep was very innovative with saliva and time use and so on. But I think purposefully, because I just really want to ensure that we just keep people on board as we kind of make this transition. But we've got a 1.5 hour home visit planned, and we will continue to collect you know, lots of data around their employment and economic transitions, their mental health and well-being. One of the key kind of innovations I want to introduce is to measure more cognitive process type measures. So things around leadership skills and competitiveness and risk aversion and time preference, and to find really good ways to measure those in a short survey at scale. So that will be a focus, I would say. That would be kind of the innovative part, I would say. But other than that, it's around trying to have continuity with what's gone before, and also continuity and comparability with the older studies in terms of the measures, so we can, yeah. So yes.
Very cool. No, you're right. Very important to keep them engaged at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. To adulthood.
Yeah. So it's the first time we're going to introduce incentives. We've never had incentives, and we're going to test kind of response to those experimentally and see how that goes, but hopefully. that will help.
Fantastic.
Well, yeah.
Well, I'm mindful of the time. So I'm hoping maybe if there's other questions, we can follow up on email or, but I know it's very late, especially on your end, Emla. So thank you so much for staying awake and doing this presentation. This was really, really nice to learn about the project and the findings, and this is fantastic. So yeah, I might follow up more with, I got multiple ideas for comparisons and things like that. So it'd be pretty cool.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, take care. Thanks a lot.
Good evening.
Thank you, Emla. That was fascinating.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Asha. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Take
Stay
care.
well.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, guys.